Good evening. And can you hear me okay? All right, great. Well, welcome to Wagner from a Queer Perspective. Welcome to all of you who are here at the National Opera Center, and then especially those of you who are live streaming in as well. I look forward to speaking with you for the next 45 minutes, hour or so, and so we'll begin. Hopefully all the tech stuff is going to work all right. Okay, so last summer I spent a week in Bayreuth, and it was a wonderful experience. Photo of me, in terms of in front of the Festspiel House, and then the train station, and also downtown Bayreuth, where they've got Richard Wagner sitting on a park bench. It was a really wonderful experience. But one of the things that I really realized was that how queer the productions were that I saw at Bayreuth. And so how many of you are aware of the current Tannhäuser, directed by Tobias Kratzer? Some of you? Yeah. I think you can see it on Stage Plus or something, right? Tannhäuser is a clown, and Venus is dressed in a black sequin tight outfit, and there is, of course, Le Gâteau Chocolat, who is a black British drag queen, not playing a particular character, but shows up in a rest stop where they're having Burger King, and also just in the Wartburg competition throws a rainbow flag over the harp. Now, I'm usually not a fan of, Reggie, theater, but this was actually a good production, but it was very queer. I also saw Parsifal, and any of you know, just in terms of the Scheib production, I see some head nodding. This came out around the time of Barbie, so like everything, in terms of Klingsor's second act, just hot pink, and so that was amazing. And then you can see Klingsor in his pink pantsuit. And it's a little hard to tell on the far end, but can you see how Klingsor is laying down? He's wearing high heels and he's rubbing his leg, and you can see him through the slit. So this is how he's introduced at the beginning of Act 2 of Parsifal. So again, a very queer production. And in fact, I was seeing in the Neue Presse, when the Tannhäuser came out in 2019, Bayreuth wird Gayreut, which is Bayreuth becomes Gayreut, right? And so I think there's something there, right? But on top of that, even beyond this, there were some very queer Wagnerians there. And I know none of you know what Grinder is, but I will just say that this is a cutaway of the Festspiel House. And those of you that have been there know that with Wagner's Greek amphitheater theory, that it's very steep, right? And so one of the things is that you can totally see what people are doing in front of you, right? Like, you're looking right down on them. And so with Tristan und Isolde, it was really interesting. Like after, one of the acts during the intermission, I noticed that the person in front of me was on Grindr and just having his own organizing his own Nacht der Liebe. So, so that was just one example. But, overall it was a very queer experience. And so that sort of led me to think about sort of the broader theme of Wagner from a queer perspective. And I'm looking forward to speaking with all of you about this. Now, as I did some more research, I realized that this wasn't something that was just in my own head. Over the last 2 decades, there have been some very interesting works on Wagner and queerness. And so, a seminal work was Mitchell Morris's essay, Tristan's Wounds, in 2002, in this Queer Episodes in Music and Modern Identity book. And then there's a book, Jonathan Carr's The Wagner Clan, and then Lawrence Dreyfus's Wagner and the Erotic Impulse. Do any of you know these books? Some of you? Yeah. I mean, they're really interesting. Some of them have, it's not all about sort of these issues, but there are also other interesting works. James Kennaway wrote a whole book called Bad Vibrations, sort of a play on good vibrations, on how, in the 19th century, it was thought that music could make you ill, right? Music and disease, especially Wagner's music. So we'll see a little bit more about that. And then also Barry Millington's Sorcerer Bayreuth, and then Alex Ross's Wagnerism, Art and Politics in the Shadow of Music. So those of you that don't know these works, I commend them to you. But what I'm hoping to do tonight is to bring together a number of things that they've written about, so it's all in one place. And hopefully they'll be enjoyable as well as informative. So are you tracking along? I'm speaking, okay, speed, you can hear me, everything, thumbs up, okay, great. So the outline, what I'm going to talk about tonight is I'll just tell you a little bit about myself, not too much, but like who is this person that's talking, and then queer Wagnerites, going back to the 19th century, queer Wagner and his circle of queer folks, in his circle, and then the queer Musikdramen, or the Wagnerian operas. So if that's okay, we'll go ahead and we'll start. So about me, okay? So I am a big Wagner fan. I'm closer Wagner fan. And one of the things I loved, I went to a store in Bayreuth, and I love this a doormat that says, "Hier wohnt ein Wagnerianer," right? Here resides a Wagnerite, or a Wagnerian. In the last year and a half, I have to admit, I had the good fortune of being in Dresden for the Ring under Thielemann, and then Bayreuth, as I mentioned. And then 3 months ago, I was in Berlin for Parsifal, and then also took a trip to Houston. So my husband Michael is here, and he's very understanding of my my Wagnerian trips. But he's like, have fun. But I think just so you know a little bit about my background, I'm a queer theologian, and what that means is I'm very interested in the intersections of queer theory and also religion and theology. And I've written 3 books on queer theology: Radical Love, which is an introduction to queer theology, From Sin to Amazing Grace, Queering the Doctrine of Sin and Grace, and then Rainbow Theology, talking about how the rainbow in LGBT circles sometimes doesn't reflect the rainbow of racial diversity in theologies also. And so I teach at Union Theological Seminary up at Columbia. Some of you may know, very progressive. I teach as a visiting professor of Anglican studies, and I'm also an Episcopal priest, and I serve at the Church of the Transfiguration, which is the little church around the corner on 29th. I see some head nodding between 5th and Madison. I have some parishioners here, so thank you for being here. So this is sort of where 2 Sundays out of the year, Anglo-Catholics, we have rose vestments. They're not quite hot pink Barbie vestments, but this is one of those Sundays. And so I grew up Roman Catholic, and so I'm very much attracted to the Anglo-Catholic tradition. And there is a lot of overlap between Anglo-Catholics and opera queens and Wagnerians. So that's a little bit about myself. In terms of queer Wagnerites, I just wanted to say that, I think in recent years, obviously this is Lincoln Center and Pride, but in recent years, there have been a lot of queer artists that have come out, right, that perform Wagner. So Jamie Barton, in terms of Fricka, and then, longer before, Patrice Chéreau and the Centennial Ring. David McVicar is doing a ring right now, right, in La Scala. Our own Yannick Nzesagin at the Met. Adrienne Pixona, Siglinda, and Russell Thomas, who I saw in Parsifal, and Francesca Zambello, director of the San Francisco Ring. So, it's very well known. There are a lot of LGBTQ artists, but I think it's less well known. Well, first of all, let's just say that the connection between gay men and opera goes back a long ways. And I don't know about you, but I was so interested that this is a cartoon that's over 200 years old. It was done in 1818, and it's called A Dandy Fainting, or An Exquisite in Fits. And this is, in 1818, this is a cartoon of 5 gay men, or young men, who are dandies, in an opera box. And if you look at the far left, can you see there's an opera singer in the far left, right? And so the middle guy, his legs is a little bit like Klingsor in the parts of all that I saw. He has fainted because he just loved this music so much. And one of them is putting eau de cologne in his nose, and they're like, oh, don't get it over his outfit or something like that. And so, clearly there's this connection between opera and dandyism, and also just sort of excess emotion. And so this connection, between gay men and opera, it's certainly 2 centuries. And what's less well known is that in the 19th century, it was pretty common for gay men to be into Wagner. And so, in Mitchell Morris's essay, Tristan's Wounds, he talks about Richard von Krafft-Ebing's Neue Forschungen, New Investigations. Krafft-Ebing actually has a patient. He interviews a patient who suffers from konträre Sexualempfindungen, or contrary sexual instincts. And the patient says the following. He says, "As little as I am interested in politics, so I passionately love music and am an enthusiastic devotee of Richard Wagner's, which partiality I have noticed most homosexuals have. I find that this music corresponds so precisely to our natures." 1890, right? So this is really sort of, I found this really interesting in terms of this, patient. And then actually in 1908, there's another article, another book by Xavier Maine that has a self-diagnostic questionnaire that you can tell whether you're a Uranian, as they called it, or homosexual. And one of the questions are you particularly fond of Wagner? I just would not have believed this, but so I can remember growing up and just, like being curious as to, am I gay or not? I mean, definitely am, but it's kind of interesting that Wagner was one of those tests. And then also early 20th century, that the composer Alban Berg, Wozzeck and Lulu, right, wrote to his fiancée after a trip to Bayreuth in 1909. And he actually said, "Bayreuth couldn't kill Parsifal for me, nor could the ghastly horde of homosexual Wagnerians spoil Wagner." And so, in other words, he was sort of saying also that notwithstanding the experience in Bayreuth, he still loved Parsifal, but there was a ghastly horde of homosexual Wagnerians. And so Morris writes, the Wagnerians, it seemed, included a group of listeners who understood their devotion to Der Meister, as a way of working out the transgressive sexual desires and gender identifications. And then, so all this really interesting documentary evidence. Finally, there was an essay, a critique, this writer Oskar Paniza in 1895, a critique of Wagner, and he begins his essay by citing a personal ad that was placed in 1894, just before the premiere of the season's performances of Parsifal. And the advertisement was, "Young foreign bicyclist, Christian background, seeks similar companion from very good household, up to 24 years old, for cycling holiday. And, must be good looking, distinguished manners, enthusiastic characters. Offers must be accompanied by photograph, and will be returned at once. And write to Numa 77. So Numa was sort of a coded way of talking about that you were a Uranian or homosexual in Germany back then. So, and then post restant Bayreuth. So it's sort of interesting that Panizza cites this ad. And so I was thinking back to my experience, right? Sort of the grinder of their day, right? Like personal ads, going back to 1894. And so, you've got these sort of gay Wagnerians. And again, I sort of, as a queer theologian, queer studies, I know it's sort of fraught with danger, when you talk about homosexuality or gayness going back to the 19th century, because sort of the emergence of identities, there's the whole debate about that. But so I usually talk about same-sex attracted folks or gender diverse or divergent people. But nonetheless, this is sort of when all this, German interest in same-sex classifications was going on. But also, even more interestingly, I told you that there is this whole strand of thinking in the 19th century that Wagner's music causes disease. Oh. And have you seen this cartoon? It's a lot of head nodding. It's Richard Wagner with a quarter note. I couldn't tell if it was a quarter note or an eighth note, but he's taking a quarter note, he's in someone's ear, and he's taking, he's banging on it, right? And blood is coming out, right? Meaning that like his music is creating like this bleeding in someone's ear. And so I just found this really interesting from 1869, this political cartoon, or this cartoon. And then I found this cartoon from the musical world, which was a newspaper in the UK from 1883 that's called The Parsifal Sickness. And the gentleman, Sir Stephen Round, is on the left side. He's the one who's sick. And his doctor, Dr. Mildew, is on the right, taking his pulse. And the cartoon says, Dr. Mildew feeling the pulse. What's the matter with you? And Sir Stephen Round says, I feel very ill. I've traveled all the way from Bayreuth without stopping. And Dr. Mildew said, what took you there? And Sir Stephen Round says, Parzival, I heard it 6 times. So I think there's some implication, right, that going to Parzival so many times can create sickness. And then this book I talked to you about, James Kenaway, Bad Vibrations, he talks about how the eroticism and hypnotic power of Wagner's music could undermine the willpower and masculinity of nervous male listeners. So I don't know, nervous male listeners via the nerves. There was this whole notion that to be masculine was to really have self-control, right? And so anything that was not self-control, that sort of sacrificed your willpower or excess stimulation, was feminine, right? And so therefore the theory was that if you listen to too much Wagner, it would lead young men vulnerable to the pathological condition of homosexuality. And that Wagnerism and homosexuality both came from an underlying predisposition, right? And so that was one thing. And then another thing was just sort of, Kenaway continues by luring young men into a bohemian lifestyle and by undermining their masculine willpower, you see the willpower thing, with sensual music overstimulation. Wagner's music could, it seems, create homosexuality, or at least bring out latent homosexuality. And this is, Nietzsche had the break with Wagner, but this was sort of post-break. Nietzsche compared the music to a magic potion, right? Just like Tristan and Isolde, that would emasculate the listener. Nietzsche says, just drink the philtres of this art, my friends. You nowhere find a more pleasant mode of enervating your mind, of forgetting your manliness under a rose bush. So note the rosebush part, because that will come back. But so you get all this really interesting sort of conversations about gay men and Wagner, and then also just predominantly the sort of documentary evidences of gay men, but there's also evidence in terms of lesbian Wagnerites. Alex Ross writes about. He says, as gay male Wagnerites sized up Siegfried and Parzival, their lesbian counterparts dwelled on Brunhilde and Isolde, and on the sopranos who portrayed them. And so there's a work of the apparitional lesbian, talks about the unsung history of female diva worship, which flourished in the sexually more permissive environment of the opera house. And the opera was, quote, one of the only few public spaces in which a woman could openly admire another woman's body. And then another work is Elizabeth Wood has written about the symphonic voice, which is the alto voice, right? It's sort of the lesbian erotics of opera, and talks about the symphonic voice as being erotically charged and gender ambiguous, and lesbian writers of fiction have used opera as a way of communicating the desire felt by women in the audience towards women on stage. And then finally, recently, interestingly, there's been sort of a presence of transgender and non-binary Wagnerites. How many of you know about the Regent's Opera production of The Ring? See some head nodding, right? They just had Siegfried this past year, and Holden Madagame is a transgender identified Mima, so was Mima in this production, and is also a trans activist. So I found it really interesting to have that sort of emerge. And then finally, I think no discussion of Jewish Wagnerites, or Wagnerites would be complete if we did not also talk about queer Jewish Wagnerites, in light of sort of the problems of anti-Semitism and all that. But there are some very important and interesting writings. Lawrence Mass's sort of 2-volume work, Confessions of a Jewish Wagnerite, Being Gay and Jewish in America, and On the Future of Wagnerism is a work that's I commend to you. Barry Kosky, the the director of the Meistersinger from a few years ago at Bayreuth, and the first Jewish director. And I think he's doing a ring now at the Royal Opera, right? The sort of well-received one so far, just Rheingold. And then Yuval Sharon, the first American at Bayreuth with a Lohengrin, a couple, the electrical Lohengrin in blue. Sort of, he's also, Jewish and queer. And so I think there's a lot of this really interesting stuff out there from the 19th century until today on sort of the connection between queerness and Wagnerites. So let me continue a little bit about then moving from Wagnerites to Wagner himself, right? Queer Wagner. And so most of you know, right, that Wagner was very much known as a womanizer, right? I mean, he was married twice, Minna and Cosima, and they overlapped. And, Cosima had 2 children with him while she was still married to Hans von Bülow, right? I mean, it's all very complicated. But then he had a thing for married women, right? So Jessie Lassault, he met her in France, and they were going to run away to Greece, I think, until her husband caught them. Matilda Wesendonck is the muse behind Tristan und Isolde, and he lived under the largesse of her husband and her, and had this intense relationship. People question whether or not it was ever consummated, and then Judith Gautier was sort of his muse for Parsifal, and then, but there's all this stuff about Wagner and sort of the womanizer. So some of you might be like, well, what do you mean by queer Wagner, right? Because it's so clear that he's such a womanizer. But again, there's some very interesting caricatures of Wagner going back to the 19th century. Here you have a cartoon of him, and you can see he's wearing roses. So remember Nietzsche's comment about the rose bush. And he's wearing sort of these flowery outfits, and he has high heels, and he has all these shoes under him, right? Women's shoes and all that. And it's called Atlas in music. Like he's this giant Atlas, and yet he's sort of wearing sort of this these outfits in a feminine outfit. This was 1877. And then this cartoon from 1876, the year, sort of the first ring at Bayreuth, you can see he's being penetrated, right, by this, sort of the German spike hat, right? And it's interesting. It's called The Musician of the Future. It's hard to read, but it's the Théâtre de Charenton Bayreuth. And so in French, Charenton was an insane asylum. And so it was sort of, they were equating Bayreuth with insane asylum, and he's being penetrated and all this. So there's something going on here, right, with him. And then there's this really interesting work that was published in 1903 by Hans Fuchs called Richard Wagner und die Homosexualität. In this book, Fuchs writes, he says the composer is a spiritual homosexual, meaning one who adopts gay mannerisms, who values erotically charged friendships with men, but who stops short of having sex with men, right? So it never quite consummates it, but nonetheless is very empathetic to homosexuals. And so there's this book, and so I was saying to myself, well, so what's behind all of this, right? So interestingly, some of you may know about his book, right? The Artwork of the Future, Das Kunstwerk der Zukunft. It's mostly known for one of the first references to Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art. But I don't know how many of you know that there's a really interesting discussion that Wagner has of this thing, Männerliebe, men-to-men love, okay? It's in the part where he talks about statues, right? Beautiful statues, and he actually talks about the Spartan love between men. And this is in the Artwork of the Future. And Wagner writes in translation, the beauteous naked man is the kernel of all Spartanhood. This love of man-to-man, Männerliebe, in its primitive purity, proclaims itself as noblest and least selfish utterance of man's sense of beauty. For it teaches man to sink and merge his entire self in the object of his affection. And Spartans were encouraged to have same-sex relationships because it was thought that they would fight even more sort of fiercely for their loved ones in war, right? And so Wagner says, it's not just purely spiritual. It's interesting, right? He's a spiritual homosexual, but he says Spartanism was not just purely spiritual friendship, but this spiritual friendship was the blossom and crown of the physical friendship. and the latter sprang directly from the delight in the beauty, aye, and the material, bodily beauty of the beloved comrade. So this is Wagner himself, writing about Männerliebe. And then, this is sort of, there's a little bit of sexism here, but Wagner had this fetish for silk and satin, right? Some of you may know this, but others may not. But around the time of when Bayreuth was opened, a bunch of his letters to his tailor, his supplier of silk and satin, got leaked. And so this journalist, sort of released these letters that showed him buying just yards and yards of silk and satin. And so this is a cartoon showing him, right, like dressed in satin, and the journalist has the pen or the quill behind him. But these are some of his own drawings of his sort of nightgowns and his pants. It was said that he suffered from a skin disease, so that he needed to have silk and satin. But this is his own designs of the kinds of things that he liked to wear. And so there's some definitely gender bending here. And he had, like in his Vienna home, right before he met King Ludwig of Bavaria, Ludwig II, he had a boudoir. Lawrence Dreyfus writes, satin was a serious matter for the composer. Bertha Goldbach, Bertha was his supplier, executed the interior decor of the entire villa, including one special room, a Venusberg-like grotto, luxuriously lined with silk walls, with lavishly hung satin rose garlands strewn all around, costly covers and pillows, soft carpets. In this boudoir, as Bertha calls it, Wagner liked to be alone and rarely permitted anyone else to enter. And he liked to feel exceptionally warm, and his soft house slippers had to be stuffed with cotton and all that. And he also very much liked the scent of roses. So he also had sort of rose perfumes and all that. So this is just sort of an interesting thing. And this goes again back to Nietzsche and the whole rose bush. So that's sort of an interesting thing. But most interestingly, I feel that there were three very important people in Wagner's circle, his closest circle, that were queer. One was Paul von Ukowski, who was sort of a hanger-on towards the end of Wagner's life, who actually was there the day that Wagner died in Venice. Then, as I mentioned, King Ludwig II of Bavaria, who basically, I think without him, we probably would not have Wagner's works, because Wagner, in addition to be a womanizer, spent a lot of money and was always in debt and was virtually bankrupt. Anyway, more about that. And then finally, Wagner's only son, Siegfried Wagner, was pretty much an open secret that he was gay. And so, just wanted to mention a few things that I found interesting. So first of all, Paul von Ukowski was a hangers-on in the Wagner household. And here's a picture of him. He had an Italian manservant called Peppino, who would sing Italian songs. And I think eventually Richard and Cosima discovered that they were lovers. So Peppino and Ukowski was together. But Ukowski was sort of this close family friend that he appears in these photos, right? Here's another picture of him. And he was the set designer of the first Parsifal in Bayreuth, right? And so he did this. And there is a really hysterical picture that he drew called The Holy Family in 1881. Do any of you know about this? Okay, so this is a picture of the Holy Family with the Wagner children as members of the Holy Family, right? Like of the angels. Daniela is Mary, you have Blandina, Isolde, Eva as angels, and you have Siegfried as the baby Jesus, okay? Do you notice that von Ukowski is there? He is Joseph. He inserts himself in this picture, right? And so it's a very interesting thing. And so, as I said, he was actually there for breakfast at Wagner's death on February 13th in 1883 in Venice. And so that's sort of an interesting part of Wagner's life that is not well known about. And actually, there's another interesting thing that Wagner was friends with a gay couple in London. Some of you may know that he went to London in 1855 to conduct a series of concerts because, again, he needed to raise money. Didn't make a lot of money back from this. Actually met Queen Victoria. Prince Albert. But it's said that during that time, he actually preferred to spend time with this gay couple, or same-sex couple, Prosper Saint-Ton, who was a French leader of the Philharmonic Society, and Herr Lüders, a full-blooded German musician, who lived together, Wagner said, like a married couple, each tenderly concerned for the other's welfare. Sex seems always to have been in the air when Wagner was about. So, again, sort of an interesting sort of history. King Ludwig II, I guess a lot of you know about Ludwig, right? King of Bavaria, sort of known for his being the Mad King and building Neuschwanstein Castle, which is the inspiration for the Disney castles, for all of you Disney fans out there, of whom I am one. And also, so Ludwig, from a young age, was enchanted by Wagner's Lohengrin, right? Not only the opera, but he, Ludwig had all these paintings of Lohengrin, the Swan Prince, in his castles growing up. And the interesting thing is that when Ludwig became King of Bavaria at the age of 18, one of the first things he did was to send a courtier to look for Wagner because he wanted to meet him, right? And so when the person went to Wagner, Wagner thought it was sort of someone looking for him like a creditor, trying to collect his debts. And so he actually was trying to avoid this. But then he realized it was, in fact, he got a royal audience. And this is some of the correspondence that Ludwig wrote to Wagner. This is a letter. Ludwig writes, "My only friend, my ardent loved one, you are the star that lights my life, and your glance always strengthens me wonderfully. I burn for you, oh my holy one, my adored one. How I love you, my only one, my most cherished possession. Son of my life, my inspiration and love for you are boundless. Once again, I swear my loyalty to you unto death, eternally, eternally, your Ludwig who burns for you." Now, granted, 19th century, sometimes you have, rhetorical flourishes, but this is pretty intense, right? And there is some correspondence of Wagner writing back to him, and Wagner's a smart guy, right? Like, Ludwig's funding his lifestyle, so Wagner is also, sort of very, very fond of Ludwig also. But I love this one too. There's an actor called Joseph Kainz. And there's a picture of Ludwig with the actor, good-looking guy standing on the left of him. But what's really interesting is the photo, the original of the photo actually has Joseph with his hand behind the king. Can you see that? This is the original photo, and it was scandalous, right? Because first of all, the woman was usually the one that was seated in these portraits, so to have the king sit there, but then Kainz was had his hand behind him, so the official photo, blotted out the sort of the hand thing. But it's interesting. There's stories about Ludwig taking Kainz to. Ludwig had created a Venusberg grotto and took him in there, and Kainz was kind of ditzy, didn't really get what Ludwig was doing, and so I think his agent also said, just play the character, or whatever. So, but anyway, Ludwig mysteriously drowned with his doctor in 1886, and sort of ended his life. But those of you that have been to Haus Wahnfried, right, Wagner's home in Bayreuth, knows that there's Ludwig all over the place in the study, the piano room. You've got a portrait of Ludwig. The bust in front of Wahnfried is Ludwig, and then there's a stained glass of him as well. Finally, in terms of Siegfried Wagner, Wagner's son, it's the homosexuality of Siegfried Wagner, the composer's only son and heir of Bayreuth, was an open secret, right? And commentators portrayed him as a feminized and almost effeminate version of his father. So, his father was pretty effeminized, right, in the cartoons we've seen, but another American critic called Siegfried a pert and primping impostor. And if you know the book, The Wagner Clan, there's actually a very moving story about Siegfried Wagner and his friend, Clement Harris. And I was actually very moved by this. So apparently, Clement met Siegfried, and they spent a summer in Bayreuth. And Clement's father was a ship magnate. And so Clement proposed that he take a trip with Siegfried to the Far East on one of his father's ships, right? And Siegfried loved the idea. And it turned out that they were the only two passengers on the on the ship, right? And so they basically spent all this time together. And Siegfried's memoirs of 173 pages, basically 103 are devoted to this voyage with Clement Harris. And 5 years later, Clement was killed. And so it's said that 3 decades later, when Siegfried composed his second and last symphonic poem, entitled Glück, Happiness, he evidently dedicated it in private to the dead friend whose picture never left his desk. For all other emotional entanglements, male and female, much suggests that in Clement Harris, Siegfried found and lost the love of his life. But of course he then married, Winifred, and because he needed to have an heir and several heirs. But the Gay Museum in Berlin, the Schwules Museum, had an exhibit in 2017 called Siegfried Wagner, Bayreuth's Fairy Crown Prince. And so, and this is his portrait in Bayreuth. So as you can see, Wagner had a very queer circle, someone that sort of spent a lot of time with him towards the end of his life. You had King Ludwig II, his sponsor, if you will, patron, and then his son Siegfried Wagner. So the final section, and I think we're on time, right? So the final section is on sort of a queer reading of Wagner's operas or Musikdramen. And I think what really intrigues me is some of the productions, current productions. Some of you may know about the Hungarian State Opera's production of Parsifal from 2 years ago. And Parsifal is here surrounded by the flower maidens, and so I think Parsifal is one of those things, just sort of very homoerotic stagings. Here's another one, the Wiener Staatsoper production with Jonas Kaufmann. This is the soundtrack that just came out. This was the production that was done during COVID, so they filmed it during sort of an empty audience. But Kaufmann is Parsifal singing, but this young man, shirtless, who strips later on, is basically the young Parsifal, right? And so, there's certainly that sort of homoeroticism. And then, sort of from the beginning, like the artwork that has portrayed like Siegfried, for example, like Acts 1 and 2 of Siegfried, Siegfried with the sword and Mima, and then also slaying Fafnir the dragon and the blood. I mean, it's all sort of the Studley kind of, hypermasculine images. And I think also those of you that sort of have seen the Royal Danish Opera, The Feminist Ring from 2006, the Rhine Maidens, the Rheingold is actually this naked young man swimming, and so they are sort of like looking at the Rheingold, and he's swimming in this pool, right? And it's available on YouTube, so it's quite an interesting watch. So there is that element of Wagner operas. And then there is, of course, gender ambiguity, right? And I know last year, right, What's Opera Doc, there was a talk about this. And I think part of the funny thing is about Bugs Bunny, although, gender and Bugs Bunny and, being Brunhilde and all that. But I think, whether or not Looney Tunes was intentional or not, one of the funny lines that always gets a laugh is when Siegfried comes across Brunhilde, right? And he's like, oh yeah, ha, is it a man in armor? And then, how lovely. And then, das ist kein Mann, right? Like, this is no man, right? And so, like, there is this sort of gender ambiguity of Brunhilde, sort of going in the other direction, a man that is a woman versus a male bunny that's a woman. And then also this other sort of scene, at the beginning of Die Walküre, with Siegmund coming across Hundig's hut, and he's talking to Sieglinde, and Hundig is like looking at them, and he's like, they look a lot alike, which makes sense because they're twins, right? And so Hundig is like, how like the woman he is, right? Wie gleich dem Weibe. And so it's interesting, during Wagner's lifetime, some people would poke fun of him by using this quote to talk about Wagner. But this Hundig is like saying, look, like the glistening dragon also gleams from his eyes, right? His eyes and Sieglinde's, Siegmund and Sieglinde's matched. So you've got homoeroticism, you've got gender ambiguity, and then of course you have themes of sexual transgression. So Tannhäuser, many of you saw the season at the Metropolitan Opera. You've got the Venusberg Opera, or the Prelude and sort of all that that's all very common. I did not realize this, but did you know that Oscar Wilde's a picture of Dorian Gray? Dorian Gray is known as adopting a hedonistic lifestyle, right? And he sells his soul so that he never ages, but his picture does. But in chapter 11, he likes going to the opera to listen to what? Tannhäuser, right? So this actually, Oscar Wilde says that Dorian Gray would sit in his box at the opera, either alone or with Lord Henry, listening in rapt pleasure to Tannhäuser, and seeing in the prelude to that great work of art a presentation of the tragedy of his own soul. But I think one of the things that really shocked people about Wagner, and I don't know about your experience, but mine is that the music is so wonderful that if you stop and think about what it's really about, it's really quite transgressive, right? So The Ring is basically about adultery, right? The whole story starts off with Wotan being unfaithful to Fricka, who is the goddess of marriage, right? And she's like, okay, fine. Valhalla is fine because maybe he'll stay at home more instead of, having all these other, sort of affairs, right? And so that's when, sort of the Freya thing and then needing the Rheingold and all the, it sort of sets that into motion. And then, of course, in Valkyria, Fricka forbids him to help, Sieglinde because, it was an incestuous and adulterous relationship. So, so adultery is part of this. And adultery, as I mentioned, right? You have Sigmund and Sieglinde, who are twins, and Sieglinde is married to Hundig, and they meet each other, and and the winter storm, right, is so beautiful. Every time my breath is taken away, and at the end of Act 1, it's like it works up to this orgasmic musical, and you're like, oh, this is so beautiful, but yet you're celebrating this adulterous relationship that's also incestuous, right? So here's the other thing, right? And another Jonas Kaufmann, that Sigmund and Sieglinde are twins, right? And then and they do consummate this, and Siegfried is the child that comes out of this, right? So not only do you have adultery, you have incest. And then you may, if you think it through, Brunhilde and Siegfried are also related. Brunhilde, what's her relationship to Siegfried? His aunt. Yeah, she's his aunt. Because, right, her father's Wotan, just like Wotan is the father of Siegfried's parents, right? And so, again, this is sort of the whole Ring builds up to this and their relationship. And so again, it's sort of another incestuous relationship. And if you think about Tristan and Isolde, right, that's another relationship with Tristan and Isolde, because Tristan is the nephew of King Marka, who is married to Isolde. So what does that make Isolde? Tristan's aunt, right? Again, Wagner had something about aunts. But basically, that was sort of adulterous and also incestuous. So again, the music was wonderful, and yet, if you think underneath the stories, granted, they are myths and all this, but it really is one of the things that people were horrified about Wagner, was that if you really go beyond sort of all the musical stimulation, what are you being stimulated about? And then, I was sort of thinking other things, and, I couldn't really think of stuff. I'm sure there's stuff in Meistersinger, but Lohengrin, I thought about anonymous sex, right? Going back to Grindr again. Lohengrin just will not let Elsa ask about his name, where he came from, or what his background is. And so there's something kinky about that, but, and then he leaves, right, when she asks the question. And then finally, fetishes. I'm fascinated. Sam Abel, there's this great book called Opera in the Flesh. If you don't know it, I commend it to you. It's 1996, and Abel writes about why he thinks gay men and lesbians are so attracted to the opera. But Abel writes about operatic perverts that are fetishes. And he says Wagner is the master of the operatic fetish. He often builds his operas around objects that take on powerful sexual significance. The ring, Wotan's spear, the sword Nothung, Tannhäuser's blooming staff, Lohengrin's transmogrified swan. I can go on and on. But Wagner saves his greatest use of fetish for his final work, Parzival. That is the evil fetish of Klingsor's spear. So, almost done. I will say that, this is not surprising given Wagner's sexual ethics. We talked about his thing for married women, right? And but I will end by saying, I have the Parzival sickness. I love Parzival, and I go chasing after Parzival all over where it's performed. But I did want to sort of talk about this Bühnenweib Festspiel, the stage consecrating festival play, from a queer perspective. And if you think about it, right, and from the beginning, from the 19th century, people have always thought Parsifal was the queerest thing ever. I mean, the protagonist is the innocent fool, right, this innocent young fool who is going to save the Grail King, who actually has this wound, right, that will not heal. In the original Parsifal sort of myth, the wound is actually in his genitals. Those of you may know that Amfortas, the Grail King, got the wound because he was seduced by Kundry, and he had the spear, which was the same spear that pierced Jesus' side on the cross, but Klingsor took it and sort of wounded him as he was being seduced by Kundry, right? So the wound comes out of sexual sort of seduction, forbidden sex. And also there's been some writings about the connection between the wound and syphilis and also the side wound of Jesus. So there's all this kind of images, vulvic images, right? And then, the Grail Knights, who are this sort of homosocial group of people, right? And sort of all the voices, different ages. And they're sort of in decay because Amfortas, is in pain, will not do, sort of the bread and the wine or is reluctant and sort of they're decaying. So they need Parsifal to save them. Klingsor is the queerest villain ever, right? Because as you may know, the story is that he wanted to be a Grail Knight, and they basically rejected him, and he tried to castrate himself, right? So he castrated himself, and they still wouldn't take him. So he was dedicated to destroying them. And there is that lovely, another laugh thing, in Act 2, where he's like, the boy is handsome, er ist schön, der Knabe. There's that element. And then sort of Parzival's temptations in Act 2, right? The flower maidens, how he sort of doesn't get seduced by them. Hans Fuchs, in this 1903 book, writes, "Does Parzival not resemble here those homosexuals who greatly enjoy the company of women, who love to joke and laugh with them, who do not recoil from a teasing kiss, but who take flight when more is demanded of them?" Right? So Fuchs is saying, look, Parzival is kind of like this, right? He's fine flirting with them, but going any further, that's not okay. And then Kundry's kiss, right? And here's another from the Hungarian production with Parzival and Kundry. And first, Kundry uses the maternal metaphor, so another sort of Oedipal reference there. But Fuchs writes, after receiving a kiss so thoroughly erotic as that which Kundry had pressed onto Parzival's lips, the homosexual would have pushed the woman away with an upsurge of disgust. In Parzival's case, this kiss occasions not disgust, but rather actual physical pain. And of course, right, Parzival shouts out, Amfortas, right? Like he empathizes with Amfortas. But it's sort of this interesting thing about Kundry's kiss. And then, sort of finally this image, right, that it takes Parzival to have the wound, sort of this young innocent fool, like putting the wound to sort of the Grail King and sort of, again, this phallic and vulvic symbol. And finally, when that happens, only then is harmony restored. And so I think, there's a lot about this. And I'll just say that even back in the 1800s, Panizza, as I had quoted before, had a big critique of Parzival. He said that since the aging Wagner, like Schopenhauer, had become homosexual, many of you know that Wagner loved Schopenhauer, right? And Schopenhauer had this theory that actually that homosexuality was natural because it appeared most often in young people and old people. And this was nature's way of making sure that people that are middle-aged procreate. Do you get that argument? It was really interesting, right? Like that in order to not have old people and young people procreate, they were sort of same-sex attracted. So this article said Wagner is like one of those homosexuals that Schopenhauer talks about, and the German nation, which will always remain young, should stick to the sensual Wagner of Tannhäuser and leave Parzival to the blubberers, the penitents, and the esoteric and the old. And I will end by saying, on the flip side, Hans Fuchs says, Parzival attests unquestionably to the spiritual homosexuality of the older Wagner. And from the presence of his spiritual homosexuality, we may conclude that Wagner, as we've already indicated in several places, must have known sensual spiritual feelings of homosexual love in his younger years. And so I find this Tannhäuser-Parzival split very interesting. I will just say at the very end, this season you may know in Frankfurt, there's a gay Tannhäuser. So this is Tannhäuser with this young man, Venus is over here. I haven't seen it, I don't know if any of you have, but it looks very interesting. So that's all, folks. Thank you so much for your attention.